Sadducees would go, we kind of like things the way it is. Pharisees are nationalists, and they don't really want the Romans there anyway. Okay, so King Agrippa, who is now the follow-on to Herod, and there were several kings after that, he goes to Florus and asks for help. But Florus is in the process. He's stoking this revolt. He does not want to stop it. And so, inside the Jewish community, a civil war breaks out between them. So it's the people who don't want war and the people who do want war. They're going at it. All right? And so Agrippa, he failed at the intervention. And some of the Jews went to Masada. Okay, now Masada was a fortress that was built by Herod, and it was actually a vacation spot for him. Okay, but there was an armory there, and so there's this man who came down, Manahem, and he goes to Masada. And they break into the armory, and now the Jews are armed, and they go back to Jerusalem. They killed all the Romans that were there, by the way. And they go back to Jerusalem, and they attack the Antonia fortress, okay? So this is the Antonia fortress right here. So there was under siege, and they come back, and they overcome the Romans that have killed all the Romans that were there. He was an Idumean. Yes.
Dan, this is the question. Are you going to get to the Christians getting a prophecy to flee to Pella in the middle of all this?
Yes.
Okay, I'm done.
Well, they took the prophecy from Christ, okay, and they exited.
Okay.
Yep. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, get
okay.
Out of before this.
Get out of there. Yep. Okay, so within the Zealots, right, some of them, Eleazar ben Simon, thought that Manahem was just too wild, and so eventually he kills him. So this conflict between the Zealots now is happening. There's fighting everywhere throughout Judea. Jews against Jews, Jews against Romans, Jews against Syrians, right? So remember, this is a Syrian province, so there would have been Syrians there. And Jews against Greeks. They didn't like anybody. And basically, this revolt rolled all the way down to Alexandria, Egypt. Okay? And it was pandemonium, right? Okay, so Shelley was waiting for me to say that. Okay, anyway. So now down in Egypt, though, there were 2 legions plus 5,000 soldiers, 17,000 soldiers. They're traveling through there, and they put down the rebellion there. And, of course, lots of people died, and they plundered the Jewish section. All right. Now, back to the governor, Cestus Gallus, governor of that whole region. He assembles an army, and with Agrippa, King Agrippa, as a guide, basically, navigating down through Judea, they were putting down this rebellion, okay? And very brutal, and they marched to Jerusalem. So they get down to Jerusalem, and the plan was they were going to march in, they besieged Jerusalem, and they were going to take over Jerusalem. Jerusalem was on its last legs. It was about to fall. But Florus's cronies convinced him that Jerusalem was not going to fall, and it was very strong, and they should withdraw. And that's what they did, okay? Why? Because Florus wanted the war to continue so more Jews could get killed, basically, is what he tried to do. Okay. And this was a major blunder. So the diversion breathed new life into the Jewish revolt, right? The Jews were on their last legs, but as soon as that army diverted away from them, they said, we got it going on here, and we can win this. And so that's what they did. They got together, and they headed off, and they started chasing the Roman army with Cestus Gallus. Okay. All right. So the army retreats with the Jews hot on their heels, and the Jews were killing them in hordes along the way. I mean, they would catch them in these bottlenecks. Jews would be up on top and basically throw rocks down on them, arrows, shooting, and it was just it was pretty bloody for the Romans. They were losing a lot of people, and so they end up at this a fort, and I do not remember where that fort was, but anyway, they're still withdrawing. The major part of the army steals away in the night, and they leave 400 soldiers there. And of course, the Jews killed all of them. Okay. But Gallus and the remainder of his army escaped. Now, in Damascus, Syria, 10,000 Jews were rounded up, and they just cut their throats. Yes, sir. I was thinking the same thing. I don't know what you would do in Damascus. Okay. What I do know from the history is in Jerusalem, when they did that, eventually they just left the bodies lying. So it's 10,000 people are a lot of people, right, to handle. Yeah. He was the governor of the Syrian province. His job always, so he was a Roman. And the Romans collected taxes, and they wanted things to be peaceful. If things got out of hand and wasn't peaceful, the army came.
So he was
right?
part of the army
Because he was the governor, right? So he led the army. Yeah. All right. Back in Jerusalem, right? The Jews return triumphant, and this is where Josephus enters the picture. So he was one of the Jews that were chasing Cestus Gallus. He gets back there, and he is made the general, or is put in charge of all of Galilee for its defense. So he ends up with 60,000 footmen, 4,500 mercenaries, 600 personal guards, and so his job was to go around Galilee, reinforce the cities, make sure that all the soldiers had all of the equipment they needed, because the Romans, they're going to come back, no doubt about it. So they were preparing for them. That was part of his job, was to take care of that and to lead that effort. Now, Gallus wrote a letter to Nero, and he said, Florus is the guy that started this. And so there's this letter that Nero got that eventually he replaced Florus in AD 66. But the damage was already done. The war is on, it started, and they've basically stepped over the brink, and there's no going back. So at this point, then, Vespasian gets deployed to Judea to put down this whole rebellion, okay? That was in AD 67. And basically it was to punish the Jews. He had maybe 8 legions, so it's over around 48,000 men. I've seen a couple of places where it wasn't quite that many, but it was a lot of soldiers. So they end up coming in. They have their first encounter with Josephus's army. A lot of the soldiers fade away. They take off, and then a lot of the cities just opened the gates and let the Romans in. Why did they do that? Because if you didn't fight the Romans, they might kill some people, but they wouldn't kill everybody. So basically, then the Romans are moving throughout Judea, and they're putting down this rebellion. All right. Eventually, they get around to Jotapata, and that is where Josephus is. They cornered him in Jotapata, right? And so there's a siege that lasted 47 days, right? They also, the Samaritans were not, they didn't get out of this. The Romans killed about 40,000 people of Samaritans, okay? But back to Jotapata and where Josephus is. Okay, so Josephus was pretty wily. So the Romans built these siege ramps so they could bring up battering rams, and then they would batter the top of the wall down and also dig out the foundation, right? And then when a wall collapsed, they would go inside, right? So the Romans built up their siege ramps, and so that the bowmen could shoot across the arrows. And what does Josephus do? They built the wall a little bit higher. All right. So then the Romans had to go back and they built the siege ramps higher. All right. Josephus builds the wall a little bit higher so they can't see over it. Right. Eventually, of course, they run out of material, and the siege ramps are built up. They brought in the battering rams and they tear down the walls. Jotapata falls. Now, remember, the Romans are looking for Josephus, so they're hunting for him, and him and a contingent of his men hide. And I've seen some places say they hid in the caves. Some places say they hid in a hole. But anyway, wherever it was, they were hiding. And eventually the Romans find them. And they say, if you come out and surrender, we won't kill you. Okay? Josephus says, good plan. So he decides to come out. But his men say, no. And they threaten to kill him if he turned himself in. So Josephus comes up with a plan where they draw straws, and every man who got a short straw would kill the man next to him. And so they did that, and they committed suicide until they got down to Josephus. Imagine that. He's one of the last guys standing, and one other guy. And basically they surrendered to the Romans. Okay? So all right, so yes, sir. A siege ramp is like a dirt ramp that they could walk. And so Josephus is taken to Vespasian and Titus. He gets a private audience with them, and he predicts that they both will be emperor. So Vespasian double checks him, because Josephus had also predicted when Judea and Jotapata would fall. So Vespasian went and checked with some of the people who were still surviving in Jotapata, and then sure enough that Josephus had actually predicted that. So Vespasian believed that Josephus was correct in his prediction that he would become emperor. And he became important to Vespasian. Okay? Now, Galilee was subdued finally in AD 67 and 68, and the Jews began to fall back to Jerusalem. Okay, when the Zealots arrive in Jerusalem, they start killing all of the headmen around there. And the reason is because they weren't fighting hard enough against the Romans, okay? And so they just start killing these leaders. And in AD 68, the Romans got wind that the Jews are killing themselves. So we'll just hold back and let them kill themselves, and then we'll just walk in, and it should be a lot easier to take over Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happened. The Romans subdued all of the areas around Jerusalem and let the Jews kill each other in Jerusalem, because they were zealots, and that not everybody was working hard enough against the Romans. So anyone who did not want the Romans to die the Zealots would kill.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, they were maniacs. Okay, so
Zealots,
AD 69, Vespasian becomes the emperor. And AD 68 through 70, there is civil war between the Jews in Jerusalem. Okay? And so the Jews were killing themselves off even before the Romans ever got there. Okay, so there's two groups of Jews, one that wanted peace and those who wanted war. The second group were the Zealots, and within that there were multiple groups within the Zealots. Okay, and so the war faction, they wanted to nothing more than kill every Roman, right? They were absolutely brutal, but they were also brutal against their fellow Jews. They were pillaging and killing and raping in Jerusalem. The Zealots were, okay? And so they tended to be Pharisees, nationalists. And then there were multiple groups who fought between themselves. That's where the Civil War comes in. So now we have the Civil War in Jerusalem. One of the factions burned the corn, the stores. Okay, so they'd had enough food to last for quite a while, but one of them destroyed those supplies. So, and eventually the regular folks said, you know what, we prefer the Romans to the Zealots. And so, and they tried to surrender to the Romans. Okay, now the Romans are not at Jerusalem, so you'd have to leave Jerusalem and then go to the Romans, right? But the Zealots wouldn't let them leave. So anybody who tried to leave, they would kill them. And basically, there were a lot of people for the Passover feast that year, right? So when we hear that there's like over 1 million people died, that's very possible that happened. The Zealots chose by lot a high priest, so they displaced the old high priest. They put their own high priest in place. He was the last high priest, and his name was Phinehas, son of Samuel. Okay. The previous high priest rallied the folks and they attacked the Zealots. And the Zealots basically pulled back. And these were led by John. And John actually used subterfuge. He became a friend of Annas too. So he was privy to what was going on. Every time the regular folks were going to do something. Eventually he is uncovered. Annas too and the folks, they drive the Zealots into the inner court of the temple. Okay, so John lies to the Zealots that Annas too has colluded with the Romans to deliver Jerusalem. And of course, the Zealots are enraged by this because they hated the Romans. All right? They get a message that somehow they escape and enter the Idumeans again. Right? So they didn't go away. And basically, they send about an army of about 20,000 men. So now they're on the outside of Jerusalem. And Annas too tried to talk with them, and that was a no-go. They weren't listening to him. Storm comes up, okay? And folks say it's God is intervening in this. But the Zealots used it as an opportunity to go open the gates, and they let the Idumeans in. All right, so we have 20,000 of those soldiers come into Jerusalem, and over the next few days, 20,000 regular folks are killed. And this is where they just left the bodies lay, Bob. They just left them lay wherever they were. So I've seen a couple of places where it was like maybe a couple of 100,000, maybe 500,000, but during these festivals, it could get up easily over 1 million people, and possibly as many as like 2 or 3 million. There are arguments that Jerusalem couldn't support that many people, but the people were coming and going, so, oh yeah, it's huge, yeah. Notice No Romans are involved yet. They're not even there at Jerusalem yet. Simon is outside, John is inside, and so any of the Jews who are trying to escape, and remember this, there's a whole bunch of people there who aren't even from Jerusalem. They're trying to get out. So if they're not killed on the inside, the guy, Simon on the outside, killed them when they escaped. So it was like they're trapped in Jerusalem. All right. Now, eventually the Zealots inside let the Zealots, Simon, so Simon's outside, eventually they got tired of John. And they said, we're going to let this other guy in, maybe he'll be better. Bad move. He didn't care who he was killing. And they killed Zealots, Idumeans, just regular folks. And eventually John withdraws back to the temple again. Remember those pictures of the temple. It was a fortress. So it was, if they got in there, it was going to be real difficult to get them out. All right. So eventually AD 70 rolls around. And Titus, okay, so Vespasian has gone back to Rome. Titus is left with the job of taking over, of handling Jerusalem. So they set up camps here, and over here. Remember, there's every legion, there's 6,000 soldiers. Eventually, they breach the third wall. So their third wall goes along the outside here. And they set up a camp inside. When they're setting a camp up, the Jews come out periodically and attack them and then go back into the temple. Okay, so the Romans lost a lot of people setting this up. Then what they do is they try to breach the second wall. And the second wall is this inner wall here. The Antonia fortress is right here. So when the Romans, they breached this wall, but they had a very small breach, about the same size as what they did for the third wall. And it was too narrow. It was a bottleneck. So as the Romans passed through that, the Jews were just killing them as they came through. Okay? So 4 days later, they destroyed the whole wall. And so that wasn't a problem after that. Okay, so the Romans come in this way. But in order to get into Jerusalem proper, the Romans underdug the foundation of the Antonia fortress, and it collapsed, and then the Romans came into the city proper. Josephus, okay, so back to Josephus. He is dispatched to talk to the Jews there to negotiate a surrender. And of course, he had to be rescued by the Romans because the Zealots were trying to kill him. So then eventually he gets dispatched again, and basically the Zealots are going, no, because we'll kill anybody who tries to escape. And then Titus does something really stupid. Any of the Jews who were escaping, the Romans were killing them also. So it's like the people who were in Jerusalem were trapped, basically. Okay, so eventually they built a siege wall, and this was a siege wall the Romans did. It's not here on this, but basically 5 miles long. It took 3 days to build that wall, the Romans did. That was to protect the Roman equipment. So they had like their siege engines, the battering rams, and those kinds of things. And the Jews kept coming out and destroying that stuff. So they built this wall around there so they couldn't do that. So Josephus, once again, he tries to talk some sense into them. And basically, a few of the people got out. And then they breached the Antonia fortress. Some of the Romans tried to scale the wall, and they were killed. And then a frustrated soldier threw a firebrand through one of the windows in the temple, and it set off the fire. There was several fires in there. And basically they put the first fire out, but eventually a lot of the soldiers just threw their firebrands in there, and the place lights on fire. Okay, basically then the Romans had broken in through here. They controlled basically the whole city except for right here, and eventually they overran that area, and the temple burned in the meantime. Okay. So it took about 4 or 5 months. There were about 1.1 million people were killed there, 97,000 taken captive, and there were many of the residents, they weren't even residents of Jerusalem, they were just there for the festival. And the Romans lost about 10,000 men during the fighting. John and Simon escaped, and their fates, who knows?